Hi everyone, it's Katey, and today I have a tarot video for you. I recently did a video called Tarot Everyday, Tarot for Everyday, where I listed, I think it was about 8 tarot decks and 1 oracle that I felt were great for everyday, more practical, surface level, simple, quick fire sort of readings. And now I thought I would do basically the opposite of that and share with you the decks that I own that have been really great for those kind of deep dive readings, those heavy, really intense, soul searching, shadow work, spiritual, transcendent readings that kind of I find I have to sit with over time, that there's a lot to digest with. As I said with the previous video, of course any and every tarot deck can be used for whatever. There were plenty of decks that I even listed in that video that I very much feel like belong in this list too. In fact, I've included 2. So that is not to say these decks cannot be used for more practical readings, and it's certainly not to say that the other decks that I own can't be used for this deep diving stuff either. Just these decks, I thought this was a fun exercise. These are the decks that I feel like do that really well and lend themselves well to that sort of reading. As with last time, these are in no particular order. I do actually have a few more oracle decks to share with you this time though. And I thought I would start with my very first deck out of all of these, and it was one of my earlier tarot decks. It is the Osho Zen. Now this deck is a bit of a controversial one in the community. Many people, like I, absolutely adore it and love it. And then some people are quite critical of it. And I can appreciate both spectrums of that. I definitely sit on the side of very much appreciating this deck. And I do find it to be quite a flowy, intuitive, emotional experience. And it certainly has a way of getting really right to the heart of the matter, kind of breaking through all of those surface level excuses and kind of just accepted beliefs and truths that we've allowed ourselves to buy into. Kind of really good at breaking down all of that stuff, calling you out. It has a particular approach to tarot, and I find that that is very psycho-spiritual. It's not specifically focused on like divinity or deity or anything like that, but on finding the divinity and spirituality within yourself, and you know, improving and developing psychologically, mentally, in order to find that within yourself, that divinity. So it's a really beautiful deck, and there are things that I like about it and things that I don't, but I do think that this deck is a really powerful one, a very intuitive experience for me, and the book is really well done too. Next one I wanted to talk about is an oracle deck. It is the Wisdom Keepers Oracle by Rosie Aronson. Now this, I've done a review on this deck as well. It's huge. These are the size of the cards, they're massive. And this is definitely the sort of deck that I draw 1, maybe 2 cards, and I will sit with these cards and these images over days and weeks. In fact, I sat with 1 card from this deck for the most of last year. This is a really powerful, intense deck. There's a lot to it. And the book is absolutely essential as far as I'm concerned to the whole experience of this deck. There is so much to the book itself. There's so many different layers and elements to everything that was put into these cards and the archetypes, the people. These people feel so alive. This deck is incredible. It's moving and it's really inspiring. It really, for me, it absolutely touches my heart. I very often get quite emotional with this deck, and perhaps that's part of the reason why I can only work with it in small chunks, because I find if I work with it too often or pull too many cards, I bite off more than I can chew, because there's so much here. And the book quite explicitly goes through lessons that these cards offer us, and the lessons that the characters in these cards have gone through in order to become who they are. In working with these, I get to know these people, I get to know these characters, and that's part of the work with this deck, is just building a relationship with these people and learning from them. Now back to tarot, we have the Watersprite Tarot. This is a bit of an old favorite of mine. I don't have it out all of the time. It definitely kind of comes and goes in cycles. But I have found this deck to be this card. This card is perhaps one of the most poignant for me, and that has come up a lot and taught me a whole lot too. It's a very watery deck, obviously, given the title. I've said before that this deck feels like, it reminds me of the Hierophant, where it is very spiritual, intellectual, very much inspired by divinity in so many ways is what it feels like, or it wants to develop a connection with divinity. It wants that from you, but it requires a lot of work. It requires that you know, you're willing to be disciplined and commit to a path of healing and learning and growth. In many ways it can be a bit of a demanding deck, but I think that's what is so powerful about it. It's really quite traditional in a lot of ways, and it can be quite simple if you want to approach it in a simple way, but if you really want to get the most out of this deck, for me personally, I've just really had to commit to its lesson. I don't let these kind of really gentle watercolor images fool you. There's a lot of depth to this deck, and it's got a bit of a firm side to it, which I think, you know, sometimes we need in that growing transformative process. We need that kind of firm reminder that, yeah, this might be hard work, but it's worthwhile, and we need to stick with it. Next up would be the Dreams of Gaia Tarot by Raven Phelan. This I've had an interesting journey with this deck, and I will say that plenty of people say that this deck is worth it for the book alone. I still haven't read the book. I'm very much working with this deck on an intuitive level, and it's been incredible. This deck, in some ways, it reminds me of the Watersprite, actually, in the way that it really kind of calls you out and expects quite a lot from you if you're gonna, you know, work with this deck on an ongoing basis. But it also feels quite different in the sense that it's really quite magical. It feels very old and earthy in a lot of ways. It feels very elemental, I think, is perhaps what I mean. It feels ancient and elemental. God, I love that card. There's so much about this deck that is just really moving. And although it will, I mean, of course, any tarot deck will read for whatever you want it to, but I feel like this deck is more interested, less in the smaller details and more in what those actions and choices will mean for you on your life journey. I said in one video that this deck feels like it's perfect for the height and heat of the Australian summer. And I definitely stand by that. You know, summer here where I live, this is the extreme time of year for us. It's not winter like it is, you know, in much of the northern hemisphere. In Melbourne, Victoria, you know, we have the bushfires. And up north where I used to live, in Townsville, we had the cyclones and everything. So, and the torrential rain. So it's summer that's extreme, and I feel like that's why this deck suits this time of year so well for me, is because, you know, with the fires, they burn everything away, but we have a bunch of trees and seeds that only really germinate when they have been burnt. And so, I don't know, like there's a big birth, death, rebirth sort of cycle in summer for us here, and I really feel like this deck suits that perfectly. It embodies that energy for me in so many ways. Next, I will talk about the Dreamtime reading cards by Laura Bowen. If you've been around for any length of time, you will probably know that this is a really, really special deck to me. And in so many ways, I often use this deck in conjunction with the Dreams of Gaia. I think because of that really kind of extreme, intense Australian energy that I associate with the Dreams of Gaia. I think, I mean, this deck very much fits in there too, although it is quite different. It's much more earthy. It reminds me in many ways of the Australian earth, as in like, we have this, in so many places, we have this like bright, rich red earth, soil, and that is what this deck reminds me of. And it's just, it's so beautiful and so incredible. And this is another deck that although it is one among my absolute top favorites, it's not a deck that I work with perhaps as much as I do other decks. And that is because it's really, it brings about or encourages quite big shifts for me. Like not just little small steps in the right directions, but big shifts. This deck is very much one that I will use in readings, larger things that I'm dealing with, more like themes, overarching issues that I'm approaching, rather than, you know, what should I focus on today, or what do I need to do today? This deck can certainly do that, but I just feel like its strength lies in those bigger shifts that we need to sometimes we really need to make in our lives. So I have one oracle deck left to share with you before we get back to tarot. This is the Flowers of the Night Oracle by Sherilyn Darcy. Now this is the self-published edition, but Rockpool has just released this deck in mass published it. So it will be available again, or is available at least in Australia at the moment. And this deck is gorgeous. I did do a review on it, and this backing is the best backing of any deck I think ever. I have my criticisms of this deck specifically in regards to the book, which has been changed a little bit in the Rockpool one, but not perhaps as much as I was hoping. Having said that though, my experience with this deck has outweighed, you know, the cons for me. This has been a deck that has just really showed up for me in those hard times. Not in a way that's overly nurturing and soothing. It's not a soothing deck. Rather, it is encouraging, and it does deliver it in a kind way, but not a nice way necessarily. And there is a difference, I think. It's kind and it's loving, but it's not, you know, it's not going to pretend that there's a big happy rainbow and a party to go to. It's just going to support me and hold my hand and, you know, kind of guide me through the dark. Now I do want to talk about a couple of decks that actually were in my everyday tarot video, but also just so well fit into this category as well. And the first is the Sasuraibito, which I feel like is the deck that I talk about more than any other at the moment. And to be perfectly frank, I make no apologies for that. This deck, I mean, I did say this in the Tarot for Everyday video, that this deck has the potential to go very deep. But also that its surface layers are really quite accessible. When you do go deep with this deck though, there is a lot here. I found this to be a very intuitive, emotional, moving experience. It kind of just really, it's a really good mirror, I think, for kind of the deeper stuff that we haven't quite been able to name yet, or haven't quite recognized yet. It is a very kind and loving mirror, but it is still a mirror, and more often than not mirrors are quite confronting, or they can be. So this is a really powerful deck for me, and part of why I love it so much is because it is so versatile. Like, I've included this in both the everyday tarot and the deep diving tarot, so that really says something about kind of the breadth of this deck. And how well-rounded I think it is anyway. It's a very, very powerful deck for me. And that's probably why it's become a favorite and one that I go to so regularly, is because there's so much goodness here. The other deck that I included in that list that I'm including in this one is the Next World. And I said with that video as well that this deck, why I included it in the last one, is because it's so modern. I feel like it can be taken quite literally in many ways, and that can be really useful for an everyday, like, what can I do today? Like, what can I actually physically do? Having said that though, there is so much to this deck, and it brings really interesting new perspectives to the cards. They're still rooted in the traditional meaning, but they're a new perspective entirely. Its primary focus for me has been on radical self-love, which is a very transformative thing to really embrace and bring into your life. This deck has just kind of really, I get quite emotional just looking at it and talking about it. This deck has really shifted how I view tarot in many ways, and a lot of the cards, or just kind of really brought a new richness to my experience of the cards in so many ways. Obviously I adore the imagery, and I adore kind of the really super inclusive approach the artist has taken. I think all of that is fabulous, and I just think there is so much here. Like, it's just, so much of it is so emotive as well, like the way the colors have been done, and because the people are so relatable, you really connect with them and what they're going through in the cards and their lessons. There's just a lot here. I don't know how else to put it, except that it has been a revolutionary deck for me, both in how I approach the tarot and how I support myself through difficult experiences, and embracing my lessons from the past, and embracing the challenges of the future. It's a really powerful deck. Next I will talk about the Liminal Tarot. Oh, this is an old favorite of mine. It is out of print now, but these are the decks that I own, that I go deep diving with. I love the smell of this deck. I don't know if that's weird, but it just smells so good. This is, I think, one of my favorite decks. Well, it is one of my favorite decks, but in terms of imagery, it's definitely up there. I just adore this artwork. I think it's so beautiful. There's a lot of movement. The colors really, really work to create an atmosphere in these cards. It's just stunning. And this is a very contemplative deck. It's the sort of deck that I want to sit with and reflect on. Meditate with these cards, just really sit, and not even, I do read them, but once I finish the reading, I kind of just sit with them and absorb them, not in an intellectual way at all, just in an emotional way, in an intuitive way. Like, it moves beyond an intellectual experience, and I just allow the cards to, I don't know, sink in, just to kind of sink into my subconscious and to my heart. I don't know, that sounds really corny, but that's my experience with this deck. It's just beautiful. It also has quite a childlike quality to it in many cards too, which I think is great, because we all hold that inner child in our hearts. So I think this deck can it's quite soothing to that side of us, so that we can approach those harder things that might be kind of still sitting in the back of our minds, and might still be influencing how we act, and our thoughts and our beliefs. And in soothing that more vulnerable side of us, we're able to approach those difficult things and really face them and make changes. It's quite a gentle deck. Out of all of those that I've shown, I think this would be the most gentle. Quite a lot of these are more firm, tough loving. This is more a gentle, kind, nurturing, but not in just like a super soft kind of cotton ball sort of way. It definitely is soft and gentle, but it is those things because it wants you to heal, because it wants to push you to challenge yourself, if that makes sense. So we have a couple of decks left, and I did want to talk about the Gill Tarot. Now, I know this isn't a deck for everyone, and that's okay, but it is my deck. It is my #1 deck. And there is a reason for that, and that is because this deck speaks absolutely and directly to my soul. Like, I don't feel like there's any intermediary space where I have to think about what this deck is saying to me and try and work it out. And it just, I don't know, it just speaks to my soul. It tells me what I need to know, what I need to do, in a clear way, in a supportive way, in a loving way, but also just in a really matter-of-fact way. Like, it's like, here, this is what we're dealing with, and this is what you're gonna have to do. And so in that way, it can be difficult to work with. Not difficult to read, just challenging to work with, perhaps is a better way of putting it. I don't use this deck all of the time. It's a deck that helps me process stuff. It helps me process what I'm experiencing so that I can do something differently. It helps me process what I'm scared of, what I'm fearful of happening in the future, so that I can approach it in a productive way. I often have intuitive pulls as to which deck I should be using, or which deck wants to be used in any given moment. But whenever I've used this deck, it's not even like a consideration. It's just, no other deck will do. I need my Gill Tarot. Yeah, I don't know, like, I don't even really go to this deck just because I want to, or because, oh, I haven't used it in a while. It's just, when something comes up, it's like an instant, this is something for the Gill Tarot and I to work through. So we're down to 2 decks, and this one I know has become a bit of a favorite amongst many tarot readers, and it is the Tarot of the Crone. Now, I don't know which edition I have because I got it in a trade without a box or anything, but I know the current edition that's available has a black border, but I'm pretty sure all the imagery has remained the same. And this deck is pretty intense. It brings it all, like, it's all or nothing with this deck. You have to be really willing and ready to commit to some pretty big lessons and changes, and insights if you're going to work with this deck. At least that was my experience. It's the sort of deck where I tend to pull 3 cards. 3 cards seems to be about right. 1 doesn't always feel like it gives enough context, but more than 5 and it feels just too much for me, a bit overwhelming. It feels very primal in many ways, like it's dealing with, or it wants to speak to our instincts and the stuff that is so ingrained in us, whether that's from childhood or from society. Like it's those really, really deep layers of belief and attitudes and habits and things like that that we just perform because that's the way it is. This deck kind of really breaks that stuff down for me. And that sort of stuff can be like shattering in terms of, you know, when your worldview is questioned, like that can be pretty heavy. So it's not always that big with this deck, but that's the sort of stuff that it gets into with me. And last but not least is another old favorite of mine. It's the Spiral Tarot by Katey Stevenson. I love this deck. It kind of feels almost like halfway between Tarot of the Crone and the Watersprite Tarot, actually, in many ways. I don't know, that's just a thought that I'm having now. I mean, it certainly has its own flair, but in terms of how it reads and the approach that it's taken and the energy of it, that's kind of, it sits somewhere in between those two things. I know a lot of people don't like these borders. I have seen it trimmed and it looks amazing. I've grown to rather like the borders. It is a very archetypal deck, especially with the major arcana. It talks about myth, archetype, psychology. There's a lot of astrology symbols and other sorts of symbols, especially in the major arcana. The minor arcana are a little bit more traditional Rider-Waite-Smith, but it's just a very psycho-spiritual deck. But it's also just what you need. I guess it isn't afraid to deal with those really touchy subjects. It's not afraid to kind of lay it all out and be like, yeah, this is where we're at and this is what we need to do. It's not easy, but let's go forward. Basically, I can't say enough good stuff about this deck. I have done a review on it. I'll leave it below and in the cards. So if you're interested, check that out. So my friends, these are what I consider my deep dive tarot decks and oracle, and these are the ones that I go to. Perhaps I don't use as often, but I do go to when I need something, when I need some light to be shed on a situation, when I really need some support moving through something difficult, or where I just know that I have some work to do. So of course I would love to hear from you, what decks you have in your collection that you would consider deep dive decks and why. And if you have any comments or questions for me, please feel free to leave those below and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already, do go ahead and subscribe. I make a couple of videos every week, so you'll be notified when I upload those. And until next time guys, so much love. Bye.